Hello everyone, my name is David. Let's start today's lesson. As long as human beings have been able to think, they have labored to find ways of making life better, safer, and more convenient. Our burning desire to improve the world around us has led to inventions that have propelled our civilization forward, from weapons to the printing press to smartphones. Even the smallest invention can have a huge impact on the world. Yet, while many inventions are originally hailed as innovations, over time they may start to show a dark side, which may lead us to wonder, were they a mistake? Today's lesson has two parts. Part 1 discusses small inventions with great impact. Part 2 discusses controversial inventions. When we speak of inventions, we tend to think of massive innovations, like the internet or the discovery of steel. But sometimes huge impacts can have modest beginnings. Let's talk about a notable small invention that changed the world, barbed wire. When we walk past a restricted area, it's almost certain that we will see barbed wire. This steel, sharp wire is often used on top of fences to prevent people from climbing them, and is a common sight in junkyards, factories, and military bases. Of course, barbed wire is so common that many of us view it as a simple, ordinary item. But it has a rich and interesting history. Barbed wire was invented in the U.S. state of Illinois by Joseph F. Glidden in 1873. It was intended to provide better fencing. It sounds like a strange need to meet, but back then, many people in the United States needed good fencing.
You might have heard the expression from Robert Frost's classic poem, Mending Wall. Good fences make good neighbors, and this was literally true in Western America at the time.
America was growing. A decade before the invention of barbed wire, President Lincoln had recently passed the Homestead Act. This act gave away millions of acres of land in the American West for free to any citizen willing to move and claim it. It was meant to encourage Western migration and settle new territory in the United States. With an increase in settlers came an increase in livestock. The American West was mainly flat grassland, ideal for the raising of cattle. Managing herds of cows was an integral part of the Western economy.
Some settlers attempted to protect their land by building stone and wooden fences. Stone fences were difficult to build, and they were impossible to cover large areas of the vast plains. Wooden fences were easier to build, but cattle could break through the fences by pushing on them. What's more, wood was a scarce commodity in the West, and transporting it from America's coasts was too expensive. To solve this problem, a man named Joseph came up with an idea. He saw an interesting demonstration. Someone designed a wooden rail with spikes sticking out from the sides of the rail. Joseph later improved this idea and invented the first version of barbed wire. This later became the basis for the modern barbed wire used in the United States and across the world today.
Barbed wire provided reliable, inexpensive fencing. It was said to be lighter than air, stronger than whiskey, and cheaper than dust. Though cows had run through other kinds of fencing easily, they would not cross the wire's sharp spikes.
When you visit the city of the DeKalb in Illinois, where modern barbed wire was invented, you'll find something really strange about the town. You can see barbed wire all over the town. There are businesses named after barbed wire. The local museum has an entire section dedicated to barbed wire. Even the city itself is nicknamed Barb City. Barbed wire not only put the town on the map, but also revolutionized America.
Barbed wire became known as the invention that tamed the West. It finally allowed people to establish clear barriers between their property. In doing so, it made private ownership in the West possible. Prior to barbed wire, it was impossible to identify where someone's property began and ended. With barbed wire fences, settlers could finally enforce their claims. By creating boundaries between property, barbed wire sped up the development of the American West. Part of this was because barbed wire encouraged more settlers to claim land. As more claims were secured, the territory became more populated, leading new settlers to expand even further west. Barbed wire also resulted in greater agricultural development. Barbed wire fences protected farmers' land and crops from being damaged by wandering herds of cattle. By being able to fully cultivate farmland, farmers could increase the value of the land. Without barbed wire, their claims could never have been used for agriculture. But barbed wire was also controversial. One of the most serious consequences of barbed wire was an event known as the Big Die-Up. Previously, during the winter, cows tended to move southwards, where it was warmer. But this often resulted in herds of cows getting mixed up, which caused a headache for cow farmers. As a result, they built a massive stretch of barbed wire to prevent northern cows from moving south. Between the winters of 1885 and 1887, a series of severe blizzards caused a huge number of cows to head south. But the cows were stopped by barbed wire fences and had nowhere to go. Many froze or were crushed to death. In the end, thousands of cows died, and many cow owners went bankrupt. Another controversial consequence of barbed wire was illegal fencing. As the West became settled, it created a clash of values between cowboys and settlers. Cowboys were accustomed to treating the lands as free and thought of barbed wire as a threat to their herds. Wealthy cattle farmers began to build barbed wire fences on public land to illegally seize more territory for themselves. Of course, cowboys and less wealthy cattle farmers were not pleased about this. The result was a series of conflicts known as the fence-cutting wars. Cowboys and less wealthy cattle farmers formed gangs and cut holes in illegal fencing to let their cows through. As tensions increased, the conflict turned violent, leading some men to kill each other. Eventually, the government made both illegal fencing and fence-cutting crimes, but the barbed wire did not come down. The fence-cutting wars represent the last attempt to keep the western land open and free. When they stopped, the old way of life in the West ended forever, and the new one, brought on by barbed wire, was fully established. Who could have ever thought that such an ordinary invention would revolutionize U.S. history? As we saw with the fence-cutting wars, even seemingly simple inventions can be controversial. And oftentimes, the more revolutionary the invention, the more divided the response to it is. Let's take a look at one of the most important advancements of the 20th century, nuclear energy, and the controversial inventions that arose from it, nuclear weapons and nuclear power plants. From the beginning, nuclear energy was originally used for military purposes. During World War II, in order to develop plutonium for nuclear weapons, the United States government authorized the creation of nuclear reactors. By August 1945, the United States had successfully constructed 3 nuclear bombs. At the time, while the war in Germany had ended, Japan still refused to accept defeat. As a result, the United States dropped 2 nuclear bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Over 100,000 people were killed. Some simply disintegrated from the heat of the blast. Others were horribly burned. In the weeks that followed, tens of thousands more died as well. Most of them were civilians. 6 days later, Japan admitted defeat. Of course, if the United States had invaded Japan by land, the death toll would have been staggering. Nevertheless, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were highly controversial. Many in the military, as well as the scientists who developed the bombs, were opposed to the attacks. They knew that nuclear weapons had destructive capabilities the world had never seen before. Some claim that there was no need to drop the bombs. Others have argued that it was morally unacceptable. Even the general who issued the order to drop the bombs said, "If we had lost the war, we'd be tried as war criminals." Since 1945, no more nuclear bombs have been used in warfare, but thousands have been built. Some believe it isn't right to have weapons so powerful, while others believe it prevents dangerous powers from attacking other countries. In any event, it remains hotly debated. Following World War II, nuclear power was adopted within the civil sector to provide energy. As of April 2017, there are 449 nuclear reactors in 30 countries, with 60 new power plants currently under construction. Supporters of nuclear energy believe it is the only serious alternative to fossil fuels because it provides clean and reliable energy on a large scale. Wind and solar energy cannot meet the planet's energy demands on their own. And since climate change is an urgent issue, they believe we should take advantage of the technology we have, not the technology we'd like to have. But others are critical of nuclear power. Since the mid-20th century, there have been several nuclear meltdowns that have resulted in serious environmental destruction and loss of life. One of these events, the Chernobyl disaster, was featured in our Dongni course. Chernobyl was a nuclear power plant near the town of Pripyat. As we remember from our Dongni course, on April 26, 1986, the reactor was shut down for an unauthorized safety test. Because of flaws in the reactor design and mishandling by the reactor operators, there was an uncontrolled power surge. As our Dongni course says, this surge caused the reactor to overheat and build up pressure until its structure failed and it blew up, releasing large amounts of radiation. More than 50 reactor workers were killed. Some 50,000 people were forced to leave the surrounding area. Long-term effects of the disaster, such as cancers, are still being investigated. But the environmental fallout may have been worse. In the months after the disaster, increased radiation levels were detected across much of Europe. The forest area near the reactor site is one of the most radioactive places on Earth. Although all is not lost, the forest around the disaster area has begun to make a recovery. Animals such as elk and eagles have been seen in the area, and birch trees are growing where radioactive trees used to be. To quote our course, nature can recover and even thrive where humans cannot. So perhaps, even in the face of nuclear disaster, the planet can survive. Nevertheless, if nuclear energy can cause so much devastation, is it worth the risks? What do you think? Nuclear energy is a relatively modern development, and barbed wire is still used today, but no longer has the impact it once had. But not all controversial inventions are new, and not all old inventions are irrelevant. To illustrate this, we're going to talk about something as old as human civilization that still sparks intense debate today: alcohol. Alcohol has been around for thousands of years. The earliest evidence of alcohol was found in China, in jars unearthed in Jiahu that date to around 7000 BC. Evidence of wine production dates back to 5400 BC in Iran. And beer in ancient Egypt dates back to around 3000 to 2000 BC. Sometimes it was given to workers in place of wages. In fact, mankind's obsession with alcohol may even predate civilization entirely. Pre-human primates were known to consume lots of fermented alcoholic fruit. According to an evolutionary theory called the Drunken monkey hypothesis, pre-human primates used to live in trees, but moved to the ground to find more fermented fruit on the forest floor. To support this theory, it's said that the last common ancestor between primates and humans experienced a genetic change that allowed it to digest ethanol up to 40 times faster. Ethanol is an active ingredient in fermented fruit. In other words, humans came into being by evolving to consume lots of alcohol. Alcohol has not only been present throughout our civilization, it has often shaped it as well. Let's look at the role alcohol has played in human history. According to archaeologist Patrick McGovern, alcohol led the development of agrarian societies. Early humans were often hunter-gatherers traveling from place to place in search of food. But our taste for beer, which was made from fermented wheat and rice, encouraged us to settle down and cultivate grain. Alcohol has also long been associated with religion. In ancient Egypt, beer was offered to gods as a gift during religious ceremonies. The ancient Greeks and Romans held religious festivals to celebrate their god of wine, Dionysus. And even today, many Christians drink wine at church because it's said to represent the blood of Christ. And alcohol was often safer than water for many early communities. Water supplies could often be full of deadly bacteria and were not safe to drink. But to brew beer, one had to boil it, killing off bacteria. Although as much as alcohol may be partly responsible for advancements in human civilization and evolution, it also has plenty of negative side effects. Excessive alcohol drinking promotes reckless and dangerous behavior. For one thing, it impairs our motor functions. When we drink too much, we have trouble walking or speaking. One notable risk from this is drunk driving. Every day, 28 people in the United States are killed from alcohol-related driving accidents. Alcohol also narrows our focus of attention and hurts our ability to think clearly. It can also make us prone to aggression, which can cause us to react violently in situations where we normally wouldn't. For example, if we're drunk at a bar and someone insults us, we may start a fight with them, even though we wouldn't if we were sober. And drinking too much alcohol can lead to alcohol poisoning, a potentially fatal condition. On American college campuses, where students often drink excessively, over 200 students have died from alcohol injuries since 2010. Long-term health risks associated with alcohol abuse include heart disease and certain kinds of cancers, as well as mental disorders such as dementia and depression. Among those who die from long-term excessive alcohol consumption, their average lifespan has been shortened by 30 years. There have been several attempts to ban alcohol during human history. The most successful attempt was in the United States between 1920 and 1933. During this time, the U.S. government made it illegal to sell, produce, or import alcohol. But this did not stop Americans from drinking. A black market of illegal alcohol emerged, and with the market came notorious criminals like Al Capone, who you might remember from our Dogny course. Outside of the Prohibition Era, though, alcohol has never been effectively banned, despite its clear health risks. Let's talk about why. For one thing, the alcoholic beverage industry is just too profitable. In many countries, alcohol is an important source of tax revenue. Consider the United States. In 2016, revenue from alcohol taxes amounted to $9.8 billion. In that same period, the UK, a country smaller than the US, generated almost $15.7 billion in alcohol tax revenue. Would you turn away $15.7 billion? Not to mention, any attempt to prohibit alcohol would be going against over 10,000 years of human evolution. Considering that our primate ancestors were spurred on to evolve because they wanted to eat more alcoholic fruit, a ban on alcohol would go against our very genetic conditioning. Perhaps to drink and to suffer from drink is part of what it means to be human. We can also look at the consequences of the Prohibition Era to understand why a ban would be unsuccessful. Even though major alcohol producers were forced to close, alcohol was still able to be brewed illegally in large numbers because it is easy to produce. But without proper processing, illegal alcohol could be fatal. Nearly 10,000 people died from drinking illegal alcohol. What's more, the black market that emerged to meet the alcohol demand only strengthened organized crime. Statistics show that during Prohibition, the price of illegal alcohol went up, generating over $1 billion in untaxed revenue annually. Most of that money went to criminals, funding other activities like prostitution and gambling. So, in effect, Prohibition did not stop drinking. However, as a result, organized crime flourished, there were more deaths from a lack of proper processing, and the government lost money. Perhaps, like marijuana, it is better to regulate something harmful than try to criminalize it. When it comes to inventions, we will never know what the real effects will be. What seems to be a slight upgrade or change could lead to historical advancement, or revolutionary technologies could cause suffering and death. But while some inventions can bring devastating consequences, the inventions themselves are not wrong. It's the people making use of those inventions that matter.
This is all for today. Let's have a quick review. First, we talked about a small invention with great impacts, barbed wire. We learnt why and how barbed wire was invented. We also discussed the significance and controversial consequences of this invention. Second, we talked about two controversial inventions, nuclear weapons and alcohol. Well, everyone, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you, and see you next time.